started here. Good morning and welcome to Wrestlers. We'll get started here now. This is the class where everything is relevant, where there are no bad questions, where all questions will be answered. Okay.
Sadly. I've heard some bad questions in this class.
You may hear.
This is where we apply God's Word to God's world. So thank you all for coming out this morning. I have a couple of readings for us. Regarding the schedule, we have 2 dates in May that have not yet been scheduled, and I'm going to be talking to Junior about a possibility for a guest speaker coming in for the 2 dates in May that are not yet defined for our schedule, and if that doesn't happen, then we'll just stop early. All right, and we'll start up in the fall again. But we'll let you know about that next week. I have a passage here from the Scriptures from Proverbs 9. Maybe this would be a good starting point, and for an invitation for our talk today. Wisdom's feast. Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. She has slaughtered her animals. She has mixed her wine. She has set her table. She has sent out her servants. She calls from the highest places in the town. You that are simple, turn in here. To those without sense she says, come on, eat of my bread and drink of the wine I've mixed. Lay aside immaturity and live, and walk in the way of insight. From the Proverbs of Solomon. I have another passage that is, I think, relevant here today. And this is from the last page of a book by Alistair McGrath, The Future of Christianity, where he quotes Karl Barth. Theology is not a private subject for theologians only, nor is it a private subject for professors. Fortunately, there have always been pastors who have understood more about theology than most professors. Nor is theology a private subject of study for pastors. Fortunately, there have repeatedly been congregation members, and often whole congregations, who have pursued theology energetically while their pastors were theological infants or barbarians. Theology is a matter for the church. And I thought that was pertinent to the context of the talks last week and today, where we have our invited guest, Professor Roy Clouser, coming down from New Jersey to talk to us about both philosophy and theology, and how I guess they're tied together here. And we're going to be hearing from him. So let me just open with a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for promising to be present with us and to be our teacher. And we pray that you'll guide our thoughts and lead us into wisdom, lead us into maturity and an understanding of you, and get better acquainted with you as a result of our experience together today. So we thank you for bringing us together, and we pray for Roy's safety in his travels. We thank you for his willingness to share with us. Guide him in his thoughts today also. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. So Roy, why don't you just come on up here, and Roy was introduced last week, so if you want to go ahead and share a little bit about your background, feel free to do that. I have marker pens here.
That's it. That's what I was looking for. Water. Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Let me summarize very briefly what we did last week. That is funny. And then I'll trade off of that for this week. Last week I contrasted 2 views of the nature of God. One is the view that's always been held in the Eastern Church as based on the work of the Cappadocian Fathers in the 4th century. And that was the view that was rediscovered in the 16th century by Luther and Calvin. You remember the Reformation? It was in all the papers. But Protestantism as a whole has never followed Luther and Calvin on their doctrine of God. They listened when the Reformers said you don't have to be subject to the Pope to be a Christian. Hooray! We need to reform the church. Hooray! And here here's the way the doctrine of God should go. Protestantism remained resolutely the same as Roman Catholic. And it stood in the tradition of Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas. Those are the three big advocates and sources for this. So I call it the AAA view of God. It has nothing to do with the Auto Club. As contrasted with what I call the Cappadocian Reformational view, the CR view of God, which is that the being of God is utterly unknowable, and that what we know of God is his relationships to us and the way he has accommodated himself to us. So I'm not going to repeat all of that. I contrasted those because I was asked to come here and explain what the Dutch philosopher Herman Dooyeweerd was up to when he tried to construct what he called a Christian philosophy. That is, a set of theories that would be uniquely Christian theistic and would have a different take not only on theory of reality and a theory of knowledge, but then the application of those in every science. So everything from math to physics to biology to psychology, logic, sociology, economics, ethics, aesthetics, and so on, all end up with a unique point of view. A lot of people are hugely skeptical about that as soon as they hear it. What could a view of all those things possibly be that is distinctly Christian theistic? It doesn't even seem plausible that there could be such a thing. And the usual objection goes, isn't 1 + 1 = 2 for everybody? So I'm going to use that as one of the things we talk about this morning. Now, what I need to do before we launch into that stuff, however, is to remind you of something that may have gone by a little quickly last week. And I have that up here already. What it means for something to be divine is not the same as the question, which is the true divinity? Okay? This defines what counts as divine. It's something that every religion on earth, as far as I know, does now and always has agreed with. I can't find a single exception. Not in ancient tribal religion, modern tribal religion, ancient cultural religion, ancient Babylonia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, you pick it, we can't find an exception. Something is regarded as the divine reality that brought about everything else. People put very different things into that slot. They regard very different things as divine. If you ask, what is it? Who or what is divine? You get very different answers. If you ask, what does it mean to be divine? You get the same answer. It's to be the self-existent reality that generates everything else. So when I explain that to my students, I say it's like the difference between the question, who is the president, and what does it mean to be the president? So we could have a very close election and people could be quite divided over who won, and we wouldn't agree on who the president was. But everybody agrees on what it means to be the president. We all agree on what the office is. And that's what I'm pointing to here. So the divine is the self-existent origin of everything else that's not divine. There might be more than one divinity. There might be 4 or 16.5 or a billion. Divinity might be personal or impersonal. Divinity might be conceivable or inconceivable. There are all kinds of ways to go with this. It covers all the different ideas of divinity just because I like to say just because it's the right definition and it's the only one that works. Now, this is a point that makes a big difference to Herman Dooyeweerd and what he's working from. The claim that no theory can be religiously neutral means there can be no theory about anything that isn't interpreted in the light of whatever a person regards as divine. And that will either be the true God. The true God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit incarnate, who came incarnate in Christ. That will be either that God, or there will be another one in control of that theory. Whether somebody calls it religious, admits that it is, it doesn't matter. A lot of people are as hostile as they could possibly be. I remember a fellow graduate student saying to me one time, show me any belief that is in any sense religious and I'll give it up on the spot. And it doesn't get more hostile than that. The point is, the important point is you can't. It's not possible to avoid it. Everyone regards, both claims. One claim is, it's not possible that there be nothing that's divine. If you propose that nothing whatever fits this, there isn't anything that's self-existent. Everything comes into being and passes away. So that I'll give you one argument to show why that doesn't work. And then the second one is, and everybody regards something as divine. Those two are logically independent. One could be true without the other. Everybody could believe something is divine while nothing is. Something would have to be divine while nobody believed it was. So they're independent, but I think they're both true. So let's start with those and clear those up, and then we'll go and look at a few examples of divinity beliefs controlling theories. And I'll start with our interpretation of 1 + 1 = 2, and since that seems to be the objection that everybody comes up with right away. So let's clear these up. First, the claim about reality. Why does anything at all have to be divine? Why couldn't it be that just nothing is? Why couldn't it be, for example, that one thing comes into being, gives rise to another, gives rise to another, this gives rise to this and this and this and this, and this chain has gone on from infinity and will go on to infinity, so there isn't anything you can point to that is self-existent. Everything comes into being and passes away. And the answer is that even in that case, there's still something that's left in the position of being divine, namely the whole chain, the entire infinite chain. If everything is a member of the chain, then there's nothing for the chain to depend on.
Is that the prime mover?
No. No, it goes infinite, so there is no first mover, and infinitely this way. But then the entire array of dependent things exists for what reason? Why is there that instead of nothing? We get no answer to either of those. There can be nothing for the array itself to depend on, so it has to be self-existent. So even though every member of the array comes into being and passes away, the array itself has independent self-existence. There's nothing for it to depend on.
Is that an example of the steady state theory of the 1950s?
They held that it was the universe. Right. They wouldn't have put it this way. The universe was, the question was, if you couldn't hear, was about the theory of Bondi, Gould, and Hoyle, called the steady state theory of the universe, that space is infinite in every direction, eternal, uncreated, and that what we call matter is concentrated space. Space spontaneously generates protons and other things, and that's what's self-existent. But that clearly is a view of what's self-existent. They weren't trying to get out of regarding anything that way. This is an attempt to get out regarding anything, whatever. So the answer to the question, why does there have to be such a thing, is really that we can't conceive of any cosmic scenario that doesn't leave something in that slot. We just can't think of reality as being any other way. And if you want to say, well, then that's just an accident of the way our brains happen to have evolved or something like that, you can go ahead and do it, but it's still the case that you can't think of reality any other way than something is self-existent and produces or either is everything or produces everything else that isn't. Now again, that doesn't settle the question, what is it that's self-existent? That's not, that doesn't settle what really is divine. It just settles what it means to be divine. As to why it is we should believe that that not only is there something divine, but people can't help but believe it. The first answer to a Christian group such as this is that the Scripture teaches us that God has created human beings for fellowship with Himself, that their sense of divinity is born in them, that they were made for fellowship with God, and they can't get away from that entirely. What they can do is ruin it. They can put a false God in the place of the true one, but they can't get away from being religious. And that's an old tradition in Christian theology, and it's supported by plenty of Scripture. There are different ways of putting that. Luther had a typically blunt, unforgettable Lutheran way of putting it. Man is like a jackass. Either God or the devil rides his back. He's always fun to read. But he puts it a little more forcefully in his commentary on the First Commandment. What does it mean to have a God? As I have often said, faith and trust of the heart make both God or an idol. If your faith is right, you have the true God. If not, an idol. But whatever your heart clings and entrusts itself to is really your God. Now, the only thing missing in that definition is clings and entrusts itself to as what? There's a little hiatus in that. Yes, it's what my heart clings and entrusts itself to as, and that's missing. But that, I think, Calvin supplies. Whatever is the origin of everything else is necessarily self-existent and eternal. So we put those together and you get whatever your heart clings and entrusts itself to as the self-existent eternal origin of everything else is your God. Fits together pretty nicely. Okay, so I wanted to make that point clear and then go to explaining what is meant by no religious neutrality for a theory. Yes?
Does acceptance of that concept, and you're saying we have no choice but to accept it, but anyway, does that make one religious?
Yes, it makes one religious in at least this sense. It makes a person religious in the sense that they have a divinity belief, whether it's conscious or unconscious, whether they call it that or not, and whether they practice any religion or not. So in the popular sense of being religious, a person can be completely irreligious. They belong to no group, they they participate in no worship, they have no ethics that's restrained by a religious tradition. They seem to have rejected it all. They will still have a divinity belief.
Take a man like Mr. Hitchens, a militant atheist. It also fits into that definition?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. What happens is that they have something that they regard as divine, and they just don't call it religion. So what they in fact do is condemn one religion in the name of another, while calling theirs something else. Science, for example. When in fact it's a divinity belief. Yeah. Now the question about how people, on what ground people hold divinity beliefs, has to be outside the scope of today. That's the epistemology of religious belief. That's another whole subject. I wrote a second book about that. Well, we can't do that. But what we can do is talk about this claim that it's not possible to have a theory that isn't controlled by one divinity belief or another. So what can possibly be meant by that? And so I'd like to start with the 1 and 1 is 2 example. That's okay. No higher math, because since I never got past long division, you don't need to. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it's so long as people understand the words, 1 plus 2 equals, they all see this as true. Everybody intuitively sees it as right. And there's a level at which it is the same for everybody. I mean, that is, it looks right. Then you start to question it. You start to ask about it. You can ask questions that are not so obvious as to their answers. For example, what is it that those marks represent? I mean, these are just marks on the board. What do they stand for? Okay, numbers, that's good. So, what is a number? Of course, if you, the point is that if you want to ruin the mathematics department Christmas party, you lean over the punch bowl and say, what is a number? It used to result in a food fight. Now it just results in laughter. Because the embarrassing thing is that that's a highly controversial issue over which mathematicians are severely and irreconcilably divided. These debates have gone on for centuries, and they're never going to get resolved. But I'm going to show you a few ways that it has been answered. Along with it's another question. This strikes people not only as true, but as a necessary truth. A necessary truth means one that no force within the cosmos could change. There's no way to alter that. In other words, it's not that this and this make two things here and now, but we don't know about tomorrow or 10 minutes from now. We think that it tells us what was true even a million years ago, what will be true in another 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 or whatever. It's true everywhere and at all times. How would we know that? How do we know that?
We posit it.
But why would you do that? I mean, is it just a guess? Or isn't it that that's part of the intuition? When people see it as true, they grasp that it's true in all times and places. But how do you defend that claim? So there are different answers to this. Can I show you some answers?
Inductive reasoning.
That would never give you that it's always true. Yeah. Okay, so here's one answer, and I'm going to call it the number world theory. Now, this theory was held by a whole raft of very distinguished mathematicians. You think that'll work better? Okay. The first one I'll mention is Pythagoras. You all remember the Pythagorean theorem with joy, I'm sure. 10th grade geometry class and all that stuff. The Pythagoreans, however, were not just mathematicians. They were, in fact, a community, a religious commune that worshipped numbers. And in my book, I have reprinted one of their prayers, a prayer to the number 10. You're laughing. See, now you're ridiculing somebody's religion. It begins, bless us, divine number, thou that generates gods and men, and goes on and on. You see, Pythagoras had an answer to the question, why is it that when we figure something out mathematically, if we do it right, the world's always that way? How did that happen? Particularly if we're just making it up, if we just posit it, why does it always turn out right? And his answer was, that we aren't just positing it, we discover these truths, and the reason that it always turns out right is that everything is made of numbers. That's what reality is made of. Remember last week we talked about what a theory of reality would look like, and I said theories of reality have all started this way, by asking the question, what is it in the cosmos that everything else in the cosmos depends on? What is it that has independent reality and everything else depends on that? Now Pythagoras' answer is numbers. Numbers are eternal, self-existent, and their combination makes all the things that come into being and pass away. So the combinations can come into being and pass away, but the numbers don't. The numbers are forever. They're self-existent, they're eternal, they're changeless. It's their combinations that change.
And only whole number integers.
Yeah, okay, there are problems with it, sure. All right, so that's the number world theory. The answer to the question, what do those marks stand for, is numbers. And numbers are realities we never experience. You don't see, taste, touch, or smell a number. You don't know that 1 and 1 makes 2 because this thing and this thing make 2, but because what you've intuited is something about the number world, which isn't the world we perceive and live in. It's another dimension of reality. But that's the real reality. This one is the inferior one. This one depends on the number world. This world can only be what mathematical possibility allows it to be. You getting this? Yeah. So now the people that have held this view are Pythagoras, Plato, the great mathematician Leibniz. You know the guy who invented the calculus? Yeah. Leibniz was quite a character. He got his PhD when he was 16. And, you know, I would like to be able to put on my resume that I can do calculus. I can't put that. He puts on his, he invented it. I love people like that. But somebody asked Leibniz one day, his students asked him, how do we know that 1 + 1 always makes 2? And this was his answer. 1 + 1 = 2 is an eternal, immutable truth that would be so whether or not there were things to count or people to count them. So if the whole of this world goes away, the number world will still abide forever because it's changeless, eternal, and self-existent. And that's why that 1 + 1 always = 2, because it's true of the number world. for which there's no time and no change. But you certainly see that answer controlled by a divinity belief, yes?
Thanks, Dan.
Pretty blatantly.
Is that what the what of divine is for these
Yes.
protagonists, I take it?
Yeah. Now, you come to a Christian like Leibniz, or many other Christians have held this view, and the point that I was making last week was that the vast majority of Christians have held their Christian belief. They love the Lord. And then they come to do theories, and they do theories like a pagan. They do theories that assume some pagan divinity, or that some part of the cosmos is what all the rest of the cosmos depends on. Now, you remember that I pointed out how there's an old ploy for trying to baptize that, right? You find something in the cosmos that everything else in the cosmos depends on. And if you stop there, that would be paganism, because that part of the cosmos would be divine. So all you do is add the claim, and that depends on God. There, now it's okay. Remember that? Yeah, and I tried to argue last week that comes from a false view of God that's already been corrupted by combining God with Plato. That's what happened last week.
Who was the scientist that said, that we think God's thoughts after him, so if you discover truths about the universe like this, you're just discovering more about the nature of God?
Dozens of them.
Right.
See, almost everybody in that Augustinian tradition.
Right. So,
As soon as Augustine is convinced by the Platonists that there are realities that aren't physical, and Plato called these things forms. There are not only numbers, fractions, decimals, all the mathematical apparatuses in this number world, but also there's a perfect example of every quality found in this world. So there's perfect squareness and blueness, there are lines and points, to everything. So Augustine becomes convinced of that, and he's converted to Christianity, and he puts the two together. And so in De Trinitate chapter 6, he says God is the first form, the form of all forms, and in him are all the perfections and all the numbers and all the necessary truths. And I call that the fall of theology.
We talk about heaven as a perfected earth and a reality beyond our reality.
Yeah, see, that's why this resonated with many early Christians. We believe that there is heaven in addition to earth. That's right. There's another dimension to reality, but it's not the dimension that has perfect greenness in it. It has God, the dead departed, the risen Christ, angels, but to take Plato's theory and identify it just because it's a two-level view of reality has screwed up the biblical view of that in favor of interpreting it in a Platonic and pagan way. Yes, sir?
Just to throw a curve here.
Yeah.
There are fields like physical acoustics where 1 and 1 is not equal to. In acoustics, 1 plus 1 equals 4.
Yes, well, you can do the same thing on a graph. You can go 2 this way and 4 this way, and it won't make 6. It'll come out.
2 plus 2 equals 6.
Yeah.
In that
But if what you mean is the natural number series, and you mean discrete number, the abstract number, then this is going to come out.
That's full arithmetic.
Right. Right. So this is one way of explaining all that stuff. There's another dimension of reality, and this other dimension are the eternal, immutable, self-existent truths, entities, the whatevers that make this world the way it is. And in fact, among mathematicians, this view is the plurality view. It isn't any longer the majority, but it's the largest single minority group. So, you would be bound to get this over the math department punch bowl. Somebody would hold this view. But let's take a different answer. And I'm going to contrast to this one the view of Bertrand Russell. You remember Russell, a very famous outspoken atheist of a generation ago. He wrote in his autobiography that the two preoccupations of his life were mathematics and sex. And he did a good bit of work in each area. Yeah. But Russell wrote a book called Principles of Mathematics, and in the introduction he takes on the number world theory. He says that's ridiculous. There's no other world. We're not talking about other things like that. So, and inventing this entire array of Plato's great barnyard in the sky and all that stuff. What we're doing when we do math is a shortcut way of doing logic. So really, there are no numbers. But that's because math isn't even about quantities. What it's about is logical sets and classes. So it's the logical rules and logical sets that are eternal, changeless, and immutable. And he says by math, by being a shortcut for logic, takes us back into the realm of logic, which he says is the realm of absolute necessity that holds for this world and all possible worlds. Now, do you smell a divinity belief? Because I do. This is what is eternal, self-existent, and changeless. This is what makes everything possible. So 1 + 1 = 2 is a shortcut way of writing what could be written in a logical form. I can show you that, but you wouldn't like it. You don't want to see that. No, okay. I had it on the board, and then I thought, no, I'll take that one. Okay, if anybody else wants to see it, I'll do it. So here's another view altogether. It just replaces numbers and mathematical relationships and laws with logical laws and sets, and says this is the absolute reality that everything else depends on. And that's not the end of it. John Stuart Mill wrote a 3-volume system of logic. In volume 3, he deals with mathematics. Now, Mill says that it's correct that there's no number world. But it's not true that math reduces to logic. And there are a lot of reasons for thinking that's right anyway. But Mill's candidate here for what it is that tells us about the nature of the world is that so far as we can ever know, all we can know is our own sensations. We know we see this, we hear that, we smell this, we can touch this, we can taste that. And that's what reality is. And as far as we can know, that's all there is. There may be something out there that causes us to have the sensations we do, but if so, we'll never know what that's like or whether there are such things. All we know are our own internal sensations. So for all we know, reality could be an internal virtual reality show. Now this sounds really weird. And it sounds really weird because it's really weird. And so if it sounds nuts, which I hope it does, I also hope you hold on to that. But there were some fiendishly clever arguments for this, beginning with a bishop named Berkeley. He wanted his name pronounced the Irish way, for whom the city of Berkeley is named. And Berkeley gave these arguments against materialists, the people that said reality is only physical. Remember we talked about them a little bit last week too. If you put matter in and say it's exclusively physical somethings that everything depends on, then you're a materialist. So to refute them, Berkeley argued that there are no physical things at all. He didn't argue not everything is physical. He argued nothing is physical. And he said every time you talk about a physical something, you're really only talking about your own sensations. That was his argument. So take, for example, the claim that this is solid. What do you mean by solid? Don't you mean that if you do this, that your hand doesn't go through it? Right? You mean that one sight doesn't break through another sight. A visual experience, yes? And you mean that you hear a noise and that you feel resistance. Now, if you mean more than that, go ahead and tell me what the more is. What's left to solidity that isn't just that set of sensations? And then you sit and go, and now he says, I can do that for anything you want to pick. Anything, whatever. All you do is you talk about sensations. You claim you know that there are objects outside of you. But you don't. All you have are your own internal sensations. Now, if you say to Berkeley, well then why is it that if we light a candle in this room and we leave it, we all go away, there should be no candle. Nobody's perceiving it, so there's no perception. But when we come back, the candle's burned down. So obviously it was there. He raises this. He says, yeah, that you could say this. But see, then you're overlooking that what your argument shows is not that reality isn't perceptions. What your argument shows is that there has to be at least one mind that perceives everything all the time. Which is his argument for God. So Bartlett was a bishop, so it's not too surprising that he would argue that. But those arguments are then picked up by atheists who say, well, look, one of the things you never see is God. So if we're ruling out external objects and that we're ruling out physical things and laws and all that, we'd have to rule out God too, because we never see God. God's not a perception. So that begs the question, I think. But anyway, Mill is one of those. Mill is an advocate of Berkeley's theory minus God. Mill's an atheist, and he claims that he's the only person he says he ever knew who never had a religion. But then, of course, sensations depend on what?
Your mind.
No. Often I have sensations that I don't conjure up. I don't will them. I see things I don't want to see. Things turn out the way I don't want. I'm not creating them. And when I look over here, I see a blinking camera. When I look over there, I see a railing. And not because I want to. Maybe I'd rather see 6 dancing girls or something. But it's got, I have no control over it. So I'm not generating the sensations. They just are. So now does that sound like a divinity belief? If they don't depend on anything, if that constitutes reality so far as I can know it, and that's all there is, then that has to be self-existent. And in fact, we've got more modern advocates of that too. The atomic physicist Ernst Mach, whom I hope to get to talk about as well today, but Mach held the same view. All there are sensations. And we don't know there are external physical objects. And we don't know that other people have minds because you don't see them. And there are all kinds of things we don't know. And so you say, well, what in the world's atomic physics about that? And Mach said, atomic physics is a useful fiction. This is the greatest atomic physicist prior to Einstein. This is the guy for whom the speed of sound is named. You all know, right? Mach 1's speed of sound and double the speed of sound is Mach, that guy. Yeah. Okay. So, now he certainly had a different interpretation of atomic physics then, didn't he? There are no atoms, electrons, protons. There are no molecules, just as there are no chairs and mountains and clouds and people. I mean, those are all sensations. See, whatever you have a sensation of is real, and whatever you don't is your invention. In fact, Mach says, how do you usually tell fiction from nonfiction? Isn't it because you sit down and make up the fiction? That's how you know it's fiction. Well, didn't you sit down and make up atomic theory? Then it's a fiction. That's one of his arguments.
But a useful one.
But a useful one, right, exactly. So how would Mill and Mach have to explain 1 and 1 is 2? Well, he says it exactly is that we see one thing and another thing, and we're seeing 2 things. So we make it a rule. So what do these numerals refer to? Sights, tastes, touches, smells, and sounds. And how do we know this will always be true? We don't. Mill says somewhere in the universe, 1 and 1 might be 5 and 7/8. That would be odd, like finding a black swan, but not impossible. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not getting in a rocket or even on an elevator if all that's true. But you see, they're trying to say what this is about. Is it about mysterious entities in another world? Is it about logic? Is it about sensations? Each of these is a substitute divinity. Each of these is a claim about what it is everything else depends on. Let's take one more before we go away from this example. Here's the American pragmatist John Dewey, taught at Columbia. Dewey has a different take altogether. If you ask Dewey, what do those stand for? He says nothing. They don't stand for anything. They just do a certain job. How do you know it's true? It's not. It's useful. See, on Dewey's view is controlled by his being a materialist and adding to that his two great items of faith. He's a materialist. Everything is fundamentally matter. And then out of matter, life arises and evolves. And those are the two fundamental things that drive his explanation of everything else. So human beings are, on Dewey's view, organisms trying to survive, as are all other biological organisms. And so everything that humans do is aimed at increasing their comfort or survival. What humans do to increase comfort or survival is invent tools. So for Dewey, the alphabet is a tool, a concept is a tool, mathematics is a tool, and he means it literally. And so the right interpretation of this is that it makes no sense to ask what is this, what do these stand for, any more than it would if I had a shovel in the corner and I said, what does it stand for? It doesn't stand for anything, it just does a job. And it makes no sense to ask, is the shovel true or false? No, it works or it doesn't. And that's what this is, he says. This is a tool we invented. It does certain jobs and not others. This is a marvelous tool if you're trying to balance your checkbook. It's terrible if you're trying to change a flat. That's all. And we invent the tools, and then we, by trial and error, find out where they work and where they don't. In other words, somebody tried to fix a flat with this and it didn't work. But they and this doesn't, we don't believe this because it looks true, because we just made it up. It's just like inventing a hammer or a shovel. So that's radically different from the others, is it not? This isn't true at all. In fact, that's the wrong question to ask. Now, there are a lot more views. I won't go on. But there are logicists, there are intuitionists. These people do not agree with one another on how to do math, what it can do, where to apply it, or why it works, where it does. One of the greatest advances in all of mathematics, according to most mathematicians, was Georg Cantor's theory of transfinite numbers. Cantor lived from the late 19th century into the 20th. When Einstein saw Cantor's proof for this, how to handle infinities, he said it was the most elegant proof he ever saw. Now, the intuitionist mathematicians, following Leutzen-Brouwer and all those other people you remember from your mathematical bubblegum cards. The intuitionist mathematicians claim that Cantor's entire theory of transfinite numbers isn't even false. It doesn't rise to the dignity of being false because it's utterly meaningless. So here are most mathematicians saying this is the greatest advance in mathematics, and another whole significant group saying it's utterly meaningless, it isn't even true or false. It isn't even false, let alone possibly true. So there are really hopeless disagreements here, and if you don't read anything in the history of mathematics, I've quoted in the book Professor Klein at NYU, who has written several books on the history of math. And he says that this disconcerting thing is that whereas for centuries people thought of math as pure and perfect and what everybody could agree on and logically precise and so on, it turns out by the 20th century, he wrote these books at the end of the last century, he said by the end of the 20th century it was apparent that they were divided into schools of thought, none of which could convince the other, and each of which thought the other was totally false. And that the whole idea of a unified math as the great crowning achievement, a rational achievement of Western civilization, is completely false. There is no agreement. And it doesn't look as though there's ever going to be, because what they disagree on is what's a number, and how do we know these things are true? They disagree on the axioms. They disagree on the basics. Now, I'm saying that not all those disagreements may be due to divinity beliefs, but some of them are. Some of them are inevitable. If you regard sensation as having self-existence, you're going to have a very different account of math than you will if you regard it as based on logic, or that there's a number world, or that it's neither true nor false, it's just a tool we invent that's only useful as far as it turns out to be. And as I said, those aren't the only views, but all views are controlled in this way. Dewey's is also a reflection of a divinity belief. What is it that exists besides the physical universe? Dewey says nothing. And he says in one of his books, it's false that there's any God or gods, because all there is the universe. But if all there is the universe, then it has to be divine, because there's nothing for it to depend on. It doesn't mean he has no divinity belief, he just has a different one. And viewing it as he does, as physical, and then as the biological arising out of the physical, everything after that is to be explained as evolution. So all of our concepts are what they are because the way our brains happen to have evolved. So we don't know that any of our concepts correspond to reality or anything as grandiose as that. All we know is that they work or they don't.
Well, just very briefly, it seems to me that if one represented the speed of light, and if you have going, one speed of light plus one speed of light, it would not necessarily be going two speed of light.
No, you could still add that up, and you would get the correct answer. Einstein's theory was that nothing can in fact go that fast. Okay. Not that you can't calculate what that would turn out to be. Yeah. Now, this isn't the only example. I was going to use the example of the concept of an atom in atomic physics. There have been just dozens of atomic theories. That theory was that all the big things we experience are made up of little tiny things so small we can't see them, goes back to 500 BC. And there have been dozens of versions of it, but I was going to take the three predominant ones of the 20th century and show you that they disagree with one another because each one presupposes a different divinity. Yes?
And it's a little bit more advanced, but Kurt Gödel had a famous theorem called the incompleteness theorem.
Gödel, yes. Yeah. Gödel's proof, of course.
And he basically says no set of mathematical logic can be complete. It's
right.
There's nothing self-evident. And he goes on to prove that.
No, that's not the same thing.
I'm sorry.
The two things, I don't know if you all heard this. It was a reference to Gödel's proof. What he did was construct a proof that it's not possible in any formal system to prove in terms of the system that all of its own axioms are consistent with one another. But that doesn't mean nothing's self-existent. That's a different issue. That has to do with proving consistency. Gödel, in fact, constructed a proof that God exists and thought that it worked. Now, I gave you reasons for thinking not last week. We talked about that, about the two concepts of God. Again, if God just is the most rational being and the most knowable being, and the laws of logic and mathematics hold for God as they do for us because they just are part of the divine being, then it would be perfectly proper, I think, to try to prove God's existence. But if the laws of proof are the creations of God, they're part of the cosmos, they're part of the created world. God brought into existence that there's such a thing as quantity and the laws of mathematics. God brought into existence that there are logical laws in this cosmos that govern us and all other creatures. Then it would not be proper to try to prove God's existence because you would be subjecting God to those laws. And his being isn't subject to the laws. His being is the origin of the laws. In other words, whatever you try to prove couldn't be the creator of the laws of proof. Okay, so you'll have at least one quote from Dewey read this morning. Not that he never published this as far as I know, but I put it in my book. He said to me one time, whatever can be proven would thereby not be God. Whatever you can prove is a creature subject to the laws of proof and not the creator of the laws of proof. So that trying to prove the existence of God is a misguided project from that view of God as having created everything in the cosmos.
You can certainly prove that the concept of God exists, but you can't.
Oh yeah, sure, you don't need to prove that. All you do is say to somebody, here's the concept. And then you've shown them that the concept exists, yeah. But that it corresponds to something, that's something else. Okay, this is an example of how theories get controlled by divinity beliefs. It doesn't mean that, I would say, first of all, that's not a theory. That's not a guess. We can observe this, and we can, if we abstract quantity from things, notice that if we take one unit of quantity and another unit, we get 2 units. And that can't fail to be because of the natural number series. In other words, in the natural number series, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on, every number, every succeeding number amounts to the preceding one plus the first. And if that's the rule, then you're always going to come out to 2. Right? So, yeah. All right. Can I shift gears and talk about another view? Another view is that the cosmos depends entirely on the physical, for example, or something like that. But let's do this for atomic physics. And let's take a simple thing, such as what are these atomic and subatomic particles? What is all this stuff about? And now, one view takes these to be completely physical. Let's do it that way. There are some realities or other, and early materialisms like to tell us which ones these were. The original theory said they are atoms. That atom means, it's 2 Greek words, atom, not divisible. That which can't be divided. So it's the basic unit of reality, whatever that is. That beyond which you can't get anything more basic. Okay. There are these atoms, and they are physical. They have only physical properties. They are governed by only physical laws. Now, they don't come into being and pass away. They're eternal. They are changeless. They are self-existent. But their combinations come into being and pass away. So you can get a combination of them. Over here it's a tree, over here it's a horse, over here it's a human, here it's a mountain, a cloud, a lake, a planet, a galaxy. It doesn't matter. Those come into being and pass away, but the basic units don't. So they said about the atoms exactly what Pythagoras said about numbers, and about what Mach and Mill say about sensations. These are all different candidates for divinity. They're all different sides, different parts of what we experience the world to be, and in each case that side of things is pulled out of context and the claim is made, but this is all there is, or this is what everything depends on. So there are 2 versions of this. One is to claim that all the combinations of atoms also have only physical properties and laws. That nothing has any property, any real property, over and above physical properties. Things have mass, weight, solidity, density, specific gravity, and so on. They have charge, but they do not have, as a distinct kind of properties, color, life, logical distinctness, social relations, and so on. Now, so there are 2 versions of materialism. The exclusivist says all things are only physical. The other one says the basic things are only physical, but they give rise to other things that have more than physical properties. Now, it may surprise you to know that it's the first one that's popular now. There are probably more materialists that hold the first one than the second. And they have all kinds of arguments to try to show you why our common sense way of talking about the world is misleading. It's just folk talk, the same as, yeah, that's what one of them said. Paul Churchill says this is all folklore, it's folk legend to talk about things being blue or expensive or polite or morally wrong. All that stuff doesn't exist. Things have only physical properties, and that's all there is. But we have all these folk legend ways of talking about them. And they do not correspond to reality any more than the 3 bears and Goldilocks corresponds to reality. So here's one way of understanding what atoms and subatomic particles are. They're purely physical entities, which are governed by only physical laws. That's one way. Now, of course, I've already given away what Mach wants to say. Mach held the view that all we experience are sensations, so there are no atoms and subatomic particles. and that physics is a useful fiction. In other words, if I've got 10 pounds of plutonium and 10 pounds of plutonium, and I slam these together and set off some dynamite, then these useful fictions can tell me what most likely we'll experience next. Very briefly. But it doesn't really tell us about reality. It's a fiction. So looking for, say, trying to find, as people are doing now, they're trying to find confirmation for a Higgs boson. That's what all the big array is doing in Switzerland, and the colliding, the big hadron collider. That's like going to the roof on Christmas morning and looking for reindeer tracks. For Mach, that's a waste of time and money. You don't build hadrons and try to find particles. This is all made up. He says this is a matter for laughter, he said. He says this is as silly as talking about people having souls. Okay. So that's quite a different view. Now, I'm going to put up at least a third view here and talk about this a bit, and I'm going to put two people here. One is René Descartes, and the other is Einstein, because Einstein held virtually the same as Descartes' view. And then we'll get to Werner Heisenberg. Now, the Descartes-Einstein view starts like this. We're going to have to admit to Mach and Berkeley and Mill that all that we experience are our own sensations. That part's right. But that's not all that's in our mind. That doesn't exhaust what we have in our mind. In addition to sense perceptions, there are also in our minds concepts, logical concepts that we make. And concepts don't have to be of percepts. You with me? Perceptions. Yeah, we have perceptions and we have concepts. A lot of our concepts are of the percepts, but conceptualizing can go beyond and make concepts of things we never perceive. For example, a line, a point, a triangle, a perfect circle, square roots. We don't see those things. Right? We see rough circles that we draw, but not perfect ones. And we never see a line that has only one dimension length. And we never see a point that has no dimensions. All these concepts of geometry are concepts created by the rational mind that exceed anything that we could perceive. Now, among the concepts that we come up with are that there are external objects causing our perceptions. That's one of our concepts. And Descartes says that his rule is that whenever our concepts are such that they help explain our percepts, and we can calculate them mathematically, we're entitled to believe they correspond to reality. That's the claim. Now, of course, Mill, Berkeley, Mach, they're going to say no to that. But Descartes says if we can calculate something mathematically, then it's real.
This is mind-body dualism?
Yes, that's a piece of it. So now, get this. All things that exist are rational, or that means mathematically calculable. And all that's mathematically calculable is real. So you get the motto, the real is rational, and the rational is real. It's on that ground that these two guys accept that there are external objects causing our perceptions. They each take the external objects to be purely physical, and what's in our minds to be purely sensory or purely logical. I have to watch myself because I need to leave time for the main point of this talk. Okay, so Einstein actually calls the belief in external objects the physicist's faith. As we have faith that what we calculate is real because we can calculate it, which would be true only if what we're calculating is really rational and calculable. There's no proof of that. Okay, you get the drift. So there's what's internal, but we believe in the external because we can calculate it. And he says because it helps us find our way in the labyrinth of sense perception. It makes sense of what we perceive, so we're entitled to believe. But it's faith. We don't really know there are objects outside of us. It's our faith. That is weird, man. Okay. Now, Heisenberg has a very different view. Again, I don't know that I can get to his. Because here's the point that I want to bring to you today. I offered an argument in the revised edition of the Myth of Religious Neutrality in support of this claim by Doyward that all theories are religiously driven. They all assume some divinity belief or other. For Heisenberg, he's going to go back to making reality fundamentally mathematical. He's going to say there's energy and it's almost nothing, but it's just barely something. We don't know what energy itself is, but whatever it is, it's given form by eternal mathematical laws for motion. And he says this part of my theory is a piece of Pythagorean religion. Okay. Now, here's the argument. Now, I've tried to show you what it would mean for theories to be religiously controlled. But these theories all take some different side of what we find in the cosmos. Yeah? The physical side of things, the sensory side of things, the mathematical side of things, the logical side of things. And they try to make that the self-existent origin of everything else in place of God. And here's an argument that I would like to leave you with concerning all these different claims. And it's not an abstruse argument. You don't need to do advanced logic to follow this argument at all. In fact, it's not a deductive argument. It's not an inductive argument. It's not an argument to the best explanation. So what's left? It's an experiment in thought that you can perform here and now this morning, and I'm going to ask you to do it. Let's start by picking on the materials. Everything is exclusively physical. Or is caused by the exclusively physical. Yeah? Okay, now what we're going to do is try to think of something as exclusively physical. There you go. Does this have physical properties? Yeah, it seems solid. Yes? And has attracted by gravitation. So the question is it exclusively physical? So what we're going to try to do now is to think of it as exclusively physical. It might help if you close your eyes. Here's what I want you to do. Now this is what the materialist says it is, right? So what we're going to do is say, let's try to think of it the way you claim it is. We're going to now take away from it all the non-physical properties that it has. So think about what this board eraser is, and then subtract quantity. It has no how much. It can't be numbered or counted. Its numbers aren't physical. It has no spatial shape, size, or location, because spatial properties are not physical properties. It has no sensory look or feel, not because of the limitations on what we can see, but because it just doesn't have any sensory properties. It has no logical properties. That means it's not logically distinct from anything else. And it has no linguistic properties, so it can't be referred to in language. And tell me what you're left with. What do you get when you try that?
Dark matter.
No, yeah, dark, all right, but nothing. If you take away all the other kinds of properties, you can't even conceive of the physical ones. Let me try that same experiment again, slightly differently. Instead of thinking about a concrete object, let's take an abstract physical property. It clearly is physical. Let's take weight. The property of weight. And do the same thing. What is weight that has no quantity, is nowhere in space, is imperceivable, not logically distinguishable from anything else, and can't be referred to in language? Nada. It evaporates before your mind's eye. It is gone. The claim that some kind of properties and laws found in the cosmos is what everything else depends on because it has independent existence, if there's something that's exclusively that, is meaningless. It doesn't even rise to the dignity of being false. Right? A square circle is a concept. I have the concept. That's why I know there's no such thing. I know what I'm talking about. An enclosed plane figure with 4 interior 90-degree angles, in which each side is equidistant, being at every point around its circumference equidistant from its center. But I know that can't be because of what I know about spatial shapes. But you can't even do that with the claim everything is physical. It comes up nothing. It's no concept at all. It's literally meaningless. Now the thing is that experiment produces the same results if we try it for sensory properties or quantitative or logical, or any other that you want to pick. No matter what kind you've picked from the universe, when you try to think of it all by itself, you come up with zero, zippo, nada. Try it with a sensation. Let's say a color patch of red. Try to think of that as having only sensory qualities to it. It has no quantity, it has no size, shape, or location. It isn't logically distinct from anything else. You understand what that means? There's no difference between it and an albino Tyrannosaurus. It isn't distinct from anything. It can't be referred to in language. You certainly don't have a patch of red. You don't have anything.
It's in the rainbow.
No, you wouldn't. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What's troubling me about all this atomic theory, there's no mention of E equals mc squared, the energy equivalent of mass. And
Right.
the energy has no physical properties, no weight.
Well,
mass, and so forth.
energy would have physical properties because it would exert physical effects. And it would be subject to some physical and some mathematical laws. For Einstein, for the formulator of that law. But I wasn't dealing here today with specific laws, not that, or thermodynamics, or whatever, or even something simple like all sodium salts burn yellow. I mean, we can have all kinds of examples. What I was trying to do was the science as a whole, and the way that it's interpreted being controlled by what someone sees as divine, what they take everything to depend on. Now, for a Christian, all these theories are going to be unacceptable. What the cosmos depends on is God, not something within the cosmos which alone in turn depends on God, because the only thing that mediates God's creative sustaining of the cosmos is Jesus Christ. According to Colossians 1, it's in Christ all things are held together. And to make it some part of the cosmos is to replace Jesus Christ with some piece of creation. That's the objection. So all these things depend directly on God. What is it then that hangs together all the different kinds of properties and laws and makes possible the things that we see and experience and live with every day? And the answer to that's God the Creator. It's not purely physical matter or purely sensory perceptions or purely mathematical numbers or purely logical concepts or sets or classes. All of those are pagan answers that we should avoid. And what we should go for is this view that sees no part of the creation as reducible to, that is completely explainable by, any other part. They're all interrelated and hooked up, and they're all sustained by something outside the cosmos altogether, namely God the Creator. Yes?
You're kind of saying that this is idolatry.
Yeah.
This is the
That's
modern
right.
kind of idols
That's right.
that we
That's
worship.
right. Paganism has long since ceased to be a force in the world as a cultic religion. I mean, if you want to go to Borneo or some tribal places, you can find pagan tribal practices. But paganism as a ritual practice has been driven out by modern ideologies and by major religions such as Christianity and Islam. But it retreated to the universities where it's alive and well, and it thrives in theories where it disguises itself with the name science. And we're told with great assurance that these are certainties and that they know this to be fact because they have PhDs and wear white lab coats. It's got to be right, and that these aren't really alternative divinities. These are just theories. And it's not true. They live and die by them.
Not to make up words, but wouldn't that be more scientism rather than science itself?
Well, that's another way to put it.
Which is a certain method.
Is that something?
Yeah.
No, I don't think
that's the highest creation of human thought at this point in time.
I don't think that they're deifying the method, or even claiming that if I use it, I can't go wrong. I mean, we all know there are, for anything, whatever, there are hundreds of wrong theories before you get a right one. I mean, you and I learned about Kepler's 3 laws of planetary motion, right?
Sure did.
But what most people don't know is that he proposed 83, and 80 of them were wrong. So, but you know, that's par for the course in science, and everybody in science knows that. It's not infallible or anything. It's not that the method itself is marvelous or perfectly rational or it can't be wrong. No, it's guessing.
But that is the scientific method.
But it is a scientific, nothing wrong with that.
Right.
What Doyward and others who hold this view are saying is, fine, science is a great and powerful tool. We cannot, however, allow it to be captured by non-Christian pagan assumptions and have people do it only on those assumptions and then try to identify doing science with their pagan religion. It's not true. And it can be done from a theistic point of view that refuses those reductionist explanations. Yes?
The argument just made a minute ago, is that the ontological argument for the existence of God? Same thing?
What, Gödel's? Whose argument was I talking about?
Oh.
I mentioned Kurt Gödel.
Nothing else is a satisfactory first cause other than God.
Oh, no.
Isn't that basically the ontological argument?
No.
Okay.
No, that one is ensconced directly in the view of God that I rejected last week. It's not biblical.
Oh, okay.
It takes God to be all and only perfections.
Okay.
And it says you have the concept of God as the being with all perfections and only perfections.
Okay.
Well, one of the perfections would have to be existence. Otherwise, that wouldn't be perfect. Therefore, God must exist. That is exactly what. That's Anselm's argument. Anselm was Archbishop of Canterbury, and he died in 1109. That puts it. People are still arguing over that one. But again, my response to that is whatever can be proven would thereby not be God. And I deny that God is the being with all and only perfections. I think that's not true. That's not a biblical concept. So that was last week. Yes, sir.
If a theory has no utility, what do you have then?
Well, of course you want a theory to have, it has to be useful. It has to do something for you. The main thing that a theory has to do for you is explain. And there are different ideas of when a theory succeeds in doing that. And if you're a pagan, then you are resolutely committed to saying that you have no real explanation until you've reduced this stuff to something else, which is what everything depends on. Which is why we want to say, no, that's not utility, that's futility. Because it all really depends only on God.
Go behind the podium, please.
Yes, sure.
I'll get you on the video.
I have to remain accessible to laser targets. Laser sights. Lasers. Yes.
Can we go back and review again
Yeah.
the statement from last time about Luther and Calvin's view of God as
Yeah.
something that is not picked up in the West, and
Right.
presumably it is still alive in the East in the Orthodox?
Yes, it is, and there's a strain of Lutheranism that has kept it, and there's a strain in Calvinist tradition that has kept it, but that's largely in the Dutch Calvinists, not the English and Scottish.
Can we
which
get
is
into
where
the
we
distinctives? Can we get just a quick catalog of what is unique about this Luther and Calvin's view of God?
Okay, I'll try it this way.
This will be crude.
All right. On the view of God that I call the AAA view,
The view of Anselm, Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas.
God is the unity of all the perfections. So, this is a very small pie chart, but perfect goodness, perfect justice, perfect mercy, perfect power, perfect knowledge, perfect whatever quality it is that makes something better to have it than not, God's got the infinite mode of it. In fact, God doesn't have these properties. God just is the unity of them all. Because if there had to be perfections, and he had to have them to be God, he'd have to depend on them. And none of them wanted to say that. So they instantly said, well, it's not that they exist independently of him, and he must have them. It's he just is them. Now, on the Cappadocian Reformational view, God has brought about a world. Dotted line means it's created and dependent, and solid line means it's divine. God has brought about a world in which there are things like red, green, and blue. There's goodness, there's justice, there's mercy, there's knowledge. There's also a lot of crap in the world too. But God has created all those things. And God has taken on a good number of them to stand in relation to us. So that the characteristics of God that we know, God's being personal, God's being one, God being powerful, good, are all characteristics he has taken on in relation to the world in order to relate to us. And he promises us Those are covenantal relations, and he swears to keep his covenant forever. So that's what he is to us, and that's what he always will be. And it's really true of him because he took him on. Just as in the incarnation, he took on the whole person of Jesus Christ.
But he limits himself.
That's right. These are all limited and created. That's why when we speak of them, they mean just what we mean by those terms. Not something infinite we can't understand at all, but exactly what we mean by love. When the scripture says God loves you, it means just what you think love means. It's more important because it's God that's doing it, but it means the same. And when it says he's pissed off with you, you really are in trouble because it's God who is. So that's, okay, in this view, those are all infinite properties that mean something like what we ordinarily do, but we really don't have an idea what they are. But this says, no, yes you do. So this is why Calvin, I quoted this last time, Calvin says, every perfection ascribed to God is found in creation, and hence is not God per se, but how God relates to us. Now that's exactly what Basil the Great said. We do not know what God is, but what God is not, and how he relates to creatures. So the very being of God isn't anything found in creation. So in creation, there are things with properties. God's not a thing with properties. God created all the properties. God created all the laws. God created space and time. And you can't conceive of what anything would be outside space and time and above all laws, that you have no conception whatever. That's what this view says. You have no conception whatever of this.
You can only know by analogy.
No, there isn't even an analogy. There is nothing to be analogous to.
When you say God
This view is the one that holds analogy.
Okay. When you say God is good, what is that?
It means that God treats you just the way you would expect to be treated by someone who's treating you good.
Well,
And it's covenantally specified. In other words, we're running over. God says, here's how I'm promising to be good. First of all, I'm going to forgive you, though you don't deserve it. And secondly, I'm going to give you everlasting life, though you don't deserve it. And so on. There are all these promises. God does not say, and if you believe, you'll never suffer. Everything will go great for you. There's no such covenantal promise.
rains on the just and the
Not,
unjust.
he doesn't even say you'll never suffer, you won't suffer unjustly. He doesn't say that.
You're told to expect injustice. I mean,
Yeah, that's right. And we often say, well, why did this happen? God could have done, no sweat for God to avoid that for me. Why did I have to get zinged like that?
but he did to his son.
There's no answer to that. See, over here, you've got to explain it because God's perfectly good. Well, a perfectly good being would want to stop injustice, wouldn't it? And he certainly has the power to, so what's the excuse for not doing it? On this view, the answer to that question is that's mystery. That doesn't mean it's something we can't know now. It means something to which there is no answer at all. I don't know why God made the world. I don't know why he made this one. I don't know why, if at the end of this world God can make heaven and put us all in it, he didn't just start with that. Then why do I have to put up with all this crap? There are no answers. But on this view, you don't expect to have them. You don't get them. But also on this view, God isn't subject to the same rules we are, and you can't pass judgment on them. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I think is the point of the book of Job. Remember that in every Hebrew book, the point of the book comes at the end. And at the end of Job, the book ends this way. God is livid with Job's friends for what they said to Job. What did they say? They said to Job, fess up, Job, you had to be doing something. God couldn't have done this to you unless you deserved it because he's just. And he's furious with them for saying that. They thought they were paying God a compliment. He says, no, you weren't. You were lowering me to the status of a creature that has to obey the same laws you do. So he orders them out of his sight. Get out of my sight. Go offer sacrifice and ask to be forgiven. And even then, I'm not going to forgive you till Job prays for you. For saying God couldn't do this because he's holy and just. You must have deserved it. God never said to Job, yes, you deserved your suffering, did he? He bawled him out for saying it would have been better if I had never been born. But he never said, yeah, here's what you did wrong, and this is why I zinged your butt. Never. Nothing like that. And Job got badly hurt. Isn't that right? I mean, he didn't just lose his money and his wife. His kids were killed, and they didn't come back, you know. He had more children, but he didn't get the old ones back. And I've actually had people who hold this view tell me that the point of that story is that God often has purposes we don't know about. So we suffer for his purposes. And what was his purpose? Was to win a bet with the devil. Well, I have to tell you, that wouldn't be very much comfort for me. A loved one of mine dies, and I find out that's to win a bet with whom? Why should I care who wins? And what should God care who wins that bet? I mean, to me, that's outrageous. I would say Job suffered in that case to warn all future believers that, yes, there will be undeserved suffering and that you can't judge God, but you can trust him, which is the real point of the book. Great. Okay.
Thank you
Sorry.
very much. It's really, you have a lot more that you could say. And we'll have to have you back and get some more insights on this. That the extra bonus at the end about theodicy was great. Thank you.
Okay.
Very